Do your podcast listeners sometimes lose interest midway through your episodes? Do you struggle to keep them engaged from start to finish? Our guest today, Rob Kirkpatrick, executive producer at Focus on the Family, shares his wisdom on how to captivate your audience. With more than 3 million monthly downloads across more than 15 different shows, Rob understands what works. He'll reveal his tested methods for developing emotional connections, crafting compelling stories, and structuring rewarding conversations that entice listeners to tune in and stay tuned. If you want the secret sauce for boosting engagement, you won't want to miss this exclusive interview. Hello, incurable creators. I'm excited to bring you some bonus episodes featuring exclusive interviews from the 2023 PodUp Virtual Podcasting Summit. Each Thursday for months, you're going to hear interviews from a diverse range of podcasting and marketing experts. My hope is these repurposed interviews will inspire you with new ideas and insights to take your podcast to the next level. And of course, remember to listen every Tuesday for our regular episodes of Podcasting Secrets as well. Now, let's dive into today's bonus interview from PodUp's 2013 Podcasting Summit. Hello, I'm Nathan Gwilliam, the CEO of PodUp, and your host for the Podcasting Summit. Thank you for joining us for this episode with Rob Kirkpatrick. Rob is the executive producer at Focus on the Family broadcast, and they produce more than 15 different podcasts for the Focus on the Family network. Focus on the Family has been inducted into the Radio Hall of Fame. They have an ever-growing digital audience with more than 3.3 million monthly downloads and almost 500,000 listeners. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rob.
Thanks, Nathan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Rob, today we're going to talk a little bit about how to create content that engages your listeners. I know Focus on the Family has been very successful in creating some very engaging content. Can you start off by just maybe explaining some of the most engaging content that you guys have created?
Well, we hope all of our content is engaging. Let me go back to sort of the origins of all of that, because a lot of what I've learned came from Dr. Dobson. He was the founder of this organization, and he is now retired from Focus on the Family, and Jim Daly is the president and CEO and the host of our main show, Focus on the Family. But Dr. Dobson would speak publicly. And one of the things that he observed is that if members of his audience look at their watch or yawn, that's a signal that they've disconnected. And so he brought that concept into the radio show, which is what we started as in 1977. And those principles remain for podcasting as well. This is a medium where it's primarily audio, and our goal is to be interesting. Our goal is to get messages across to people. Our goal is to engage with people. Really, although it feels weird to say it this way, but it's to have a conversation, even though the listener isn't in a place where they can actively ask questions or have a conversation with us. So everything that we're doing, and I tell my team, whether it's a 15-second spot or if it's a 45-minute or even hour-long podcast episode, the listener has to be engaged with all of that. You have to be mindful of what the listener is likely thinking and feeling at all points in the conversation. Just like even now, as here you and I are talking, that's one of the things that I'm wanting to be able to keep you, Nathan, interested in what we're talking about, and conversely, the viewers to this episode as well.
All right, so I want to start off just defining a couple of basic concepts so we make sure we're all on the same page. So when you talk about engaging your listeners or your viewers, what does that even mean?
That's a great question, Nathan, because sometimes engagement means response, or engagement means interactions with listeners or audience members outside of the content itself. I'm talking about within the content, while they're listening. You want a listener to feel as though they're sitting at the table with you while you're recording, whether it's a solo voice episode or whether you are a host or hosts panel with guests and all of that. The listener is right there at the table with you. And when you think about it along those lines, that sort of helps set the stage for you well, to be mindful that there's somebody else at the table that you need to keep engaged.
And how would you even measure that? How would you know if your audience is engaged or not?
That comes through the other type of engagement, and that is where you start to hear from your listeners. You'll hear either people that you interact with who are friends or listeners, you're out walking about or presenting at a conference or something, or if your podcast is a sales-oriented show and things like that, where you have the opportunities to be in front of the people who you hope are listening to your show. That's the feedback that you get there is where that validation occurs. But you don't have to wait for those kinds of situations, because you can always ask your listeners, hey, did you like what this show is about today? Let us know. And as long as you've got a good way for them to be able to follow through with that, that's really easy, then you'll hear from them.
Okay, so setting up ways that we can get feedback from the users. That may be commenting in a chat room or posting on a Facebook page or sending us an email. What are some of the best ways that you guys use to measure your engagement and encourage your engagement?
Our strongest feedback comes directly from the listeners, whether they call Focus on the Family or call one of the shows to be able to leave a comment or to be able to request some of the resources that we make available. That's sort of another way to tell if your listeners are really finding that the content is meaningful. It's because they're doing what you asked them to do. So if you said, hey, we've got a book, we've been talking with this author today, and we have this book available here, and if you contact us, we'll be able to get a copy to you. Well, if they contact you to do so, then that's sort of proof in a way that they've listened. But looking for those opportunities to be able to get some feedback. And did you like the episode? What have we done better? What was missing? You'll kind of hear from that too, especially for your really engaged listeners, because a really engaged listener is always going to be wanting more.
So I know this may seem like a self-explanatory question, but why would we want more engaged listeners? What are the benefits to us from that?
That's actually a really important question, because I talk to a lot of podcasters in particular who haven't really thought that through. For them, the energy and the excitement and the passion that they have to be able to get a message out there or to bring their perspective to bear in the show, that what's bubbling up within them, it becomes so much of the initial energy for all of that, but you kind of forget that there's another side to that equation. And so to be mindful of that, that's what's going to keep a listener coming back. If you're accomplishing that well, if you're drawing them into the conversation. And another reason why it's really important is because even though you'll see statistics that there's 4+ million podcasts out there, in reality, it's much, much smaller than that as far as active shows that are regularly releasing new episodes. That's less than 500,000. Only 500,000. So there's my point. You want to be able to create some content that listeners are going to want to come back to you to hear more for.
Differentiates you. Out of 500,000 different podcast options, you've got to create the ones that they're actually going to want to consume. I think I read something this last weekend that the average listener only listens to 8 different podcasts. So you've got to be one of their favorite 8 out of those 500,000.
Yeah, and I think it was Steve Goldstein who put a word picture out there that really helped me understand a way to be thinking about how to create this engaging content. So listeners have limited time to be able to engage with podcasts. And thankfully, more and more people are choosing to listen to podcasts, and that's really exciting. But nonetheless, there's still only 24 hours in a day. And on average, at least at this point in time, a really engaged podcast consumer is probably not going to listen to more than 8 different shows in a week. So if you picture a bookshelf with space for 8 books, your goal is to get onto that bookshelf. So how are you going to do that? And one of those ways, as you mentioned earlier, Nathan, is that differentiation. Because there's other people out there, likely, who are trying to bring a similar message or address a similar topic. What are you going to be able to provide the listeners that makes them choose you over those others? And I'm going to posit that one of the most significant ways to do that is to create engaging content with meaningful follow-up opportunities.
What does that mean, meaningful follow-up opportunities?
When I'm talking on about podcasting at conferences, just at Podcast Movement and coming up at PodFest and here on this summit, the content, the value of the content is the most important thing for me, especially in my role here as executive producer for all of the audio content that we produce. So there's three things that you've got to be thinking about when you're creating that content. And the first thing is that you're making that, we call it an emotional resonance connection. You're engaged with them. That's why I talk about having that listener invisibly at the table with you when you're recording, because then you have them in mind at all points during the recording session of what you're putting together. And now we get into sort of the other differentiation things. And the other objective, I call them the three objectives. The first objective, as I've just said, is that emotional resonance. And the second objective, we call it a tangible takeaway. And that means that just by having listened to an episode, a listener is able to think or do something differently only because they've listened. So you didn't set up everything where it's a constant tease. And if you want the answer to this question, sign up for my newsletter. It's not creating a frustration. You're actually giving the listener something to apply directly to their life situation and the circumstances, whatever you're talking about. So every episode has to be able to engage emotionally, that emotional resonance, and provide that tangible takeaway. But the third objective is where some real opportunity comes for you to directly interact with listeners. And that's a meaningful follow-up, because if you've accomplished the first two objectives, it's really likely that there's going to be some listeners in your audience who are wanting more from you. Well, you need to be able to provide it. If you leave them hanging at that point, you're not providing a satisfactory experience overall, even though they love your content and all of that, but they're never going to go to you for the further answers. So to be able to provide that meaningful follow-up, whether it is a list of information that you've compiled that you want to make available. When I'm talking, I present some research about some of the validations about how I came up with these three objectives. And so I make available that research to people who are attending my conference sessions so they can check it out for themselves. And Focus on the Family, since we're talking about family issues, about strong marriages and how to be an effective parent and those kinds of things, oftentimes the people who are wanting to know more really want to know, I need more, so what are you going to be able to help me with here? So we've got some resources available that are on our store, on our website, articles, things like that at focusonthefamily.com, and we'll curate, tailor-make out of those particular episodes. Here's something, if you really want to be able to go deeper on this topic, check this out. Well, when you meet that need at that level, now you're really securing a solid relationship with the listener because you're becoming trustworthy for them. And so this might be a little tangential to what we're talking about regarding engaging content, but trustworthy content is also important, because if you have a listener who is really interested in what you're talking about, they like what you have to say, they like the way you say it, they feel as though they're sitting with a friend when they're hearing you in the episode, and you've given them some things to think about, and they want to be able to go a little bit deeper, if that meaningful follow-up tends to be not meaningful and not helpful, then you've let them down. So you have to be able to be mindful that you're providing a service to the listeners. They're not just coming to hear you. Yes, they are, but at the same time, they're wanting more from you, especially if you have something to give.
Okay, so let's go back to this emotional resonance that you talked about. What are some of the best ways to do that? I mean, I can think of political shows that may evoke fear, or I can think of shock jocks, on the radio that might evoke shock. And what are some of the best ways to evoke that emotion?
We tend to think of emotion only in those extremes. What I'm talking about, something that you can draw from your own experience and bring it into the studio. For example, think of times where you're out with a group of friends and you've been engaged in a conversation and you lost track of time. Well, that's sort of a proof there that you were so engaged in the conversation that the distractions of things going on around you went dim. And so you're looking for ways to be able to have that kind of connection with your listeners. Going to the research I mentioned earlier, that was one of the things that I found pretty telling. It was research done by the Radio Ad Lab Research Organization, and they were testing the effectiveness of radio ads. And one of the things that they determined is when there was emotional resonance. And let's focus on that resonant thing. They're talking about something that's meaningful to me, not something that evokes an emotion necessarily, but something that I care about, something that I'm interested in. And they're talking to me as if they're right there with me. The research showed that when the radio ads are done in such a way that there's that emotional connection, that emotional resonance with them, that the unaided recall afterwards was significantly higher. And I always like to say this to take just a little jab at all the push we have for video. Even though video is important, the unaided recall for audio only was stronger than the unaided recall when there was also a video component. So it really points to the fact that this spoken word communication is how we're wired to communicate. And so when you're talking with a person, not at a person, and you can draw from those experiences where you've been out with others and you just lost track of time. You know, it was resonant with all of that. You know, if as your parent, let's say you're dealing with those early stages of childhood, you want to hear anybody talk about how they're dealing with that. Because help, I feel like I'm alone, and just to hear that I'm not alone. And that gets to the other side of it, really, and it's the importance of story, not just fact. So if you listen to a recording of a white paper being read, unless you're really passionately interested in that topic, you're going to turn that off pretty quickly. But if somebody told you a story about that same topic, you might not have to be passionately interested to still stay engaged.
If we want to say something that's going to be listened to, that's going to be remembered, that's going to engage the audience, story is definitely the best way to do that. I agree. Especially personal stories.
Especially personal stories. It's interesting. One of the things that, in this environment that we're in right now, where there's so much division and so much opposition, and if you don't think that way, we can't talk. Or if I don't think your way, why would I want to talk to you? There's all of the emphasis, particularly in a lot of the social media, to create this division and incite chaos and those kinds of things. Well, to be able to cut through that by saying, well, let me tell you my experience. Let me tell you what I think about that. Let me tell you what I lived through about that. You can't argue that unless you're going to call me a liar, because this is my lived experience. And so this is what I have touched. This is what I have seen. This is what I have smelled. This is what I have tasted. This is what I've lived through with regard to this particular topic. And here are some of the things I learned as a result of that, and I want to be able to share that with you.
A few minutes ago, you talked about how increasing our credibility helps our engagement. And you just gave just now a great example of how to do that by telling a been there, done that story, right? When we've gone through the journey that they're wanting to go through, and we've successfully come out the other side, we become credible, right? If we're trying to help them lose weight and we've actually lost weight, and we tell the story of how we lost weight, what we have to say is more credible and it's more engaging. Do you have any other thoughts for how we can increase that credibility to increase our engagement?
Well, if your show is a solo voice show, that can be a challenge unless you've really niched down your topic to something that you have expertise in beyond just the knowledge point, because then you're able to bring your own life experience to the table. When your show involves guests, you're looking for the guests who aren't compilers of information, but are the ones who have lived through what they've written about and are talking about. And going back to this trustworthiness, and you want to make sure that they are who they say they are. Because if you bring somebody onto your show and they're pretty convincing in all of that, but then you find out from a listener, that's how it's usually going to happen. A listener wanted to go a little deeper and they checked out the guest that you brought on and found out that they're a fraud. Who are they going to discredit? They're not going to get mad at that guest who is a liar. They're actually going to get mad at you, and because you're the one who presented them. So you've got to be really careful when you're bringing guests onto your show that the guests really, they are who they say they are, and what they have to bring to the table for the conversation is what you want brought to the table, but it's their experience, not just their knowledge.
What are the most important steps that podcasters need to take to create engaging content?
You got to plan. There are some people who are gifted out there and they could just sit down at a table and start talking and everybody's interested. Those are really unique people. Joe Rogan is really interesting that way. For whatever you think about him, one of the things that you can't deny is the fact that the guy knows how to carry on a really good conversation. He'll disagree with you, draw things more out from you, because he is just a gifted conversationalist. Those are rare. And so the rest of us, we really need to sort of plan things out, and not to the level of scripting. Rare is the podcast, except for dramatized podcasts, that a script is able to draw somebody in, but map out the arc of the conversation. So here at Focus on the Family, when we're putting together a prep for a session to prepare to record a program, the producers on my team, they'll have sort of mapped out, well, here's sort of the story arc of the conversation. Got to establish who this person is, why we brought them into the studio, what they have to say, but then let's plumb the story. We've researched that guest ahead of time to be able to know what are the gold nuggets that they have to bring to this conversation, and then structure questions to be able to draw that out. And the beauty of the fact, like we're doing here, since it's not live, if the answer that the guest gives to your question isn't the answer you expected, you can stop and say, hey, I was really looking for you to tell me this part about your story. And I'll re-ask the question, and then they'll move on and propel the conversation further. So it takes some planning, and it takes some rehearsing if you're new. When you kind of get into this mode and all of that, then you become familiar with how this show comes together, whatever it is that you're a part of. And then you're able to pull it off because you're moving ahead to your plan. Think of it this way. If you have a friend and you want to introduce another friend of yours to this person, they don't know each other, but you know both of them. And the reason that you want them to meet is because this friend over here, their lived experience will be meaningful for your other friend. You're going to conduct that conversation. You're going to draw that out from your friend whom you're introducing, and you're going to facilitate that conversation in such a way that the main points that you wanted to get out there are going to get out there.
What are the biggest mistakes that you've seen people make with their content engagement?
They don't edit. I'm sorry, you've got to edit. And I don't mean ums and coughs and uhs. When we talk naturally, we occasionally and cough and that's natural. Now, to be fair, there are some people who tend to rely on that a lot because they're buying their brain some time to figure out the rest of their answer. And so some of those things you will want to tighten up a little bit. But your goal isn't to remove all of the silence and all of the breaths and all of the ums. It really is to create something that feels very natural. It has a flow to it. And because the natural conversation is going to have some, it'll wander off the topic for a little bit. It might be good, it might be meaningful, but when you're putting together this episode, it wasn't relevant for this episode. And so you want to edit that out. You want to tighten up the episodes that you're putting together. You've got to have a plan, and you really need to have a plan for a lot of episodes. Pod fade is a huge problem. Most podcasters, when they start, they really don't get past episode 10. And that's because it's hard work. And so you want to be confident that you can, well, I'll say it this way. A consultant that we were working with a couple of years ago recommended that if you're developing a new show, what you really need to hold back on is your determination of when will I have hit my stride. And they posit that it's at episode 100. That you've really sort of hit your stride at that point. You've worked out the kinks, you have built an audience and all of that, and it's then when you're saying, all right, now we kind of have this thing nailed down. So it doesn't mean you have to have 100 episodes planned out before you can begin, but you do need to understand that you certainly have to have more than 6. Tangentially, that doesn't mean that you don't make a kill decision until you've got 100 episodes out there, because you can know pretty quickly if what you're putting together is working or not. But it does mean that there's always that opportunity for growth and improvement. And by the time you've hit episode 100, now we're talking about just minor growth tweaks to the episodes.
Can you share with us a great example of how Focus on the Family has created engaging content? And then give me one example of someone other than Focus on the Family that's created very engaging content.
Well, to be self-serving and talk about how happy I am with the content that we produce, I'm going to come at it through the back door, though, and that's through some of the listener stories that we get. Years ago, we put together a program. It was a panel of moms who were raising toddlers, and we titled that episode Mothers of Toddlers. Well, okay, that was kind of nichified, if you think about it. That's a pretty specific life stage for a lot of audience members, and we have a pretty broad audience for our show. It was really validating, though, when we got a response from a woman who said, I'm a grandmother, but I was listening to your show and it brought back all those fond memories of when my kids were young, and I was sure to share it with my daughter who's raising my grandkids. So that meant to me that even though the engagement was targeted for the specifically moms of toddlers, everybody who was listening, I say everybody, a lot of people who were listening felt engaged through that whole thing. And that's because we constructed that episode in such a way that we were mindful that we have somebody sitting at the table who actually isn't in that life stage. How do we keep them interested in the conversation? And we generally apply that principle to everything that we're doing. Another way to focus on that is something I tell podcast hosts and others is that in a conversation, the sufficient answer is better than the complete one. Because most of the time, I get it. I know where you're going. You don't need to say it again. But it's easy for a podcaster to be thinking, this is my one chance to get the answer to this question out there, so I better just dump it all out there. Here's everything that you need to know on this particular topic. And what you've actually done is totally turned off a significant majority of your audience because they got it after your first answer and they didn't need to know the rest. But, and going back to the meaningful follow-up, you provided the rest in something that the people who really wanted to know more, they could come to your website and check out your blog post or something like that, where you gave the complete answer. Another show that I find really compelling, I mentioned it before, Joe Rogan. I don't get a chance to listen to everything that he does, and I don't agree with everything that he says. And I certainly don't agree with everything that he is promoting and all of that. But I'll tell you what, he knows how to construct an engaging conversation. I'm just interested. What's he going to say next? Wow, I wouldn't have thought of that. Those are the kinds of things that really are good elements to work into the structure of your show.
Rob, what are some of the emerging trends and innovations that you see in this creating engaging content?
It's finding new ways to connect with your audience. We use Podpage for our websites for our shows, and they have a voicemail option that's contained within the service that they provide. And so encouraging listeners to be able to, and it's very easy to use, send a voicemail. In some cases, it's with a question that you want the hosts to answer, but in other cases, it's to leave your feedback. Social media. Social media is interesting because it's probably really only Facebook and Discord who have really structured the ability for a show to build a community of listeners. And here's what I mean by that. When you're a radio station, you are wanting to build a community of listeners, and you have a geographic limitation because your radio signal only goes so far. So you try to have events and things like that within your community. And what happens at those events is people come, they get to meet some of the on-air hosts that they like listening to, but they also meet other people who's like, oh, you like this place too. I didn't know that. And you get this sense of community. Well, how as a podcaster do you connect a listener who lives in Maine with a listener who lives in San Diego? And that's where some of these social media platforms that provide a good community environment are helpful to be able to do that. And that's where your goal is to let listeners interact with each other and with you. It's easy to just start by saying, hey, I want to hear from you, and let that initialize as a place where your listeners are connecting and providing their feedback to you. But you want to do that in an environment where the listeners will also see what they're saying with each other. If you use YouTube, the YouTube, chat portion is pretty good for all of that. It has its limitations, but you're looking for some ways to be able to build community. And that's some of the things that are going on right now within the technology side. The other thing is go on the road. You can use your, if you're in Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can begin to see where some clumps of listeners might occur and make a trip and then let your listeners know, hey, I'm going to be in this area at this particular time. I'm organizing a meetup and I'd love to meet you. Be able to accomplish what the radio stations are able to do in their communities, but you can do that in the cities around the country, around the world, really, where you can see, I've got some clumps of listeners here. I'd like to see about meeting with them personally.
Thank you, Rob, for sharing your time and wisdom with us today in this interview. If our audience has enjoyed what they've heard and they'd like to get to know more about you and the Focus on the Family podcast, what are the best way for them to do that?
Well, you can, I'm on Facebook. You can find me. You can also check out podcasts.focusonthefamily.com to take a look at our shows. I'm happy to help and to be able to talk about ways to create engaging content. It's one of the things that just thrills me about what podcasting is. It's still really new, and there's a lot of opportunity for people to be able to connect with one another using this medium. And I believe here in the United States, we've got freedom of speech, and it really doesn't matter where our shows are coming from. You don't have to be aligned with us to talk with me. That's why I love going to the podcast conferences and all that, and especially to be able to share some of the things that we've learned here about creating compelling content.
And if you are watching or listening and you have not yet taken advantage of the VIP upgrade, it's free. You can click on the button right below this episode and learn more about the 4 bonuses you can get for absolutely no cost just by clicking on that button below. Thank you, and we wish you success on creating engaging content. Here are my key takeaways from this episode. Number 1, create emotional resonance with listeners by speaking to them directly and bringing personal stories into the conversation. This helps them relate better. Number 2, provide a tangible takeaway so that after listening, the audience thinks or does something differently solely because of tuning in. Number 3, offer meaningful follow-ups to continue serving engaged listeners who want more on this topic. This could include resources, articles, etc. Number 4, use storytelling rather than just stating facts. Personal stories build credibility and help listeners deeply connect. Number 5, plan out a content arc for episodes to intentionally guide engaging conversations rather than just winging it. Map the flow. Number 6, edit thoughtfully. Remove irrelevant tangents, but keep some personality. The goal is highly listenable, not perfect. Number 7, build community through social media, events, etc., so listeners interact with each other around the show. And finally, number 8, survey listeners regularly about engagement and be responsive to feedback on episodes. Listener input is invaluable. Do you want your podcast journey to be simpler, easier, and much more cost-effective? Then I recommend that you check out PodUp. It's an all-in-one podcasting platform with more than 35 integrated modules to help you create, grow, and monetize your business around a podcast. You can get a free trial at podup.com. Thank you for joining us for this episode, and I wish you success in creating engaging content that will keep your listeners coming back for more.